Imagine a king so consumed by grief that he refused to let go of his beloved queen, even after death claimed her. He kept her body beside him, adorned in royal finery, speaking to her as if she were alive, and ruling the kingdom under her silent gaze. Courtiers whispered of madness, advisors feared for the realm, and visitors recoiled in horror at the king's macabre devotion. Was it love, obsession, or something far darker? This is the chilling story of love, madness, decay. In a grand palace of gilded halls and echoing corridors, there lived a monarch whose life seemed like a storybook of power, wealth, and love. His queen, a woman of unparalleled beauty and grace, was admired not only for her appearance, but for her intelligence and charm. The king, though feared in matters of state, was deeply devoted to her. Every gesture, every gift, every policy seemed to reflect his desire to please her and secure her happiness. Together, they were the picture of royalty, admired across the lands, their love a symbol of harmony between power and tenderness. Yet behind the splendor, shadows were gathering. The queen, who had ruled beside the king not only as his consort but as an advisor and confidant, fell gravely ill. At first, it seemed a minor ailment, treatable with the best physicians and the finest remedies. But days turned into weeks, and the queen's condition worsened despite every attempt at care. The king, desperate and terrified of losing her, summoned specialists from across kingdoms, pouring every resource into her survival. Candles burned at her bedside, prayers filled the halls, and ministers offered counsel, but death, relentless and indifferent, could not be swayed. When the inevitable came, the kingdom was plunged into mourning. The queen, radiant and beloved, was gone, leaving the king a shell of the man he had been. His grief was profound, visible in every action and every word. But it was not the quiet sorrow of loss. It was a consuming, unrelenting despair. He refused to accept the finality of death, rejecting the counsel of priests and advisors alike. Instead, he conceived a plan that would shock his court and define his reign. He would not part with his queen, even in death. Her body, once a source of life and joy, was brought back to the royal chambers, embalmed and dressed in the finest silks and jewels. The king ordered her coffin to remain in the palace, in a room adjacent to his own, so that he could see her, speak to her, and consult her as if she were still alive. Courtiers were horrified, whispering of madness, moral transgression, and unnatural devotion. Yet none dared oppose him. His authority was absolute, and to challenge the king was to invite ruin. Slowly, the palace began to adapt to this new macabre reality. The queen, frozen in eternal beauty, became both presence and absence, a silent witness to the king's decisions and obsessions. At first, the king's actions were private, confined to whispered words and nighttime visits. He would sit beside her coffin for hours, recounting the day's events, seeking advice from a woman who could no longer respond. His grief was genuine, but it evolved into a pattern of ritualized devotion. Servants were instructed to maintain her room in perfection: fresh flowers, polished jewels, and a carefully preserved body. Candles burned day and night, and the faint scent of embalming oils mingled with incense, creating an atmosphere that was equal parts reverent and unsettling. Yet what began as grief gradually twisted into something darker. The king began to involve her body in the daily affairs of state, placing it in a visible spot during council meetings, as if her silent presence would lend weight to his decisions. Ambassadors and nobles were unsettled, uncertain whether to treat the queen as a participant or a corpse. Some attempted to flee the palace in fear. Others whispered in corridors, plotting to convince the king to relinquish his obsession. But all attempts failed. He had wrapped his grief in authority, and those who tried to interfere were met with cold reminders of the power he wielded. The palace, once vibrant with courtly life, began to shift into a place of eerie ritual. Celebrations were muted, laughter subdued, and even the most loyal servants moved with trepidation. Courtiers reported strange behaviors. the king speaking to her as if she replied, adjusting her position during ceremonies, and insisting that she remain present at all official events. The distinction between life and death blurred within the palace walls, and fear became a constant companion. Those who had admired the monarch now regarded him with a mix of pity, horror, and dread. Outside the palace, rumors spread like wildfire. Neighboring kingdoms spoke of the king who could not let go, who lived beside a corpse while ruling a realm. Envoys reported unease in the court, and trade agreements began to falter as advisors questioned the monarch's mental state. Yet the king, consumed by his obsession, remained impervious to political caution. In his mind, the queen was not gone, she was present, guiding him, offering counsel, and preserving the bond they had shared in life. To the world, it appeared madness. To him, it was devotion. As months passed, the king's obsession intensified. He began to dress formally for his queen each day, addressing her as he would a living partner. Meals were brought to her side, conversations carried out in her presence, and the palace's daily rhythm revolved around maintaining the illusion of life. Artists were commissioned to paint her likeness, poets instructed to compose verses celebrating her eternal beauty, and ministers forced to participate in rituals that blurred reverence with terror. The line between love and obsession had been irrevocably crossed, and the kingdom, though still loyal, trembled under the weight of his eccentric devotion. But the consequences of such extreme attachment could not remain confined to the palace. The king's decisions, influenced by grief and obsession, began to strain the kingdom's resources and diplomacy. Alliances frayed, laws were passed to reflect his obsession rather than logic, and the court's fear became palpable. Servants, once proud of their service, now whispered of dark nights, strange chants, and the monarch's nightly vigils by the queen's side. Madness, once private, was becoming public, a slow corrosion of reason and stability. And yet, despite the whispers, the horror, and the political ramifications, the king remained undeterred. To him, the queen's presence, even in death, was the only solace, the only connection to the love that had defined his life. The palace had become both a shrine and a prison, a world where devotion and decay coexisted, and where the boundaries of grief, power, and madness merged into a single, chilling reality. Thus began the story of a monarch who could not accept mortality, whose love defied nature, and whose obsession would haunt the palace and the kingdom for years to come. The stage was set for a tale of devotion turned dark, power wielded through grief, and a kingdom that would never see its sovereign in the same light again. What began as grief soon spiraled into a consuming obsession that dominated every aspect of the monarch's life. Days and nights became indistinguishable as he spent hours beside the queen's coffin, speaking to her, seeking guidance, and recounting matters of the kingdom as though she could respond. The court, once lively and disciplined, now moved under the shadow of unease. Servants tiptoed through hallways, ministers whispered in corners, and the air carried an almost tangible tension. Everyone who entered the palace became acutely aware of the presence of death, framed in opulence, and the monarch's refusal to release it. At first, the king's obsession appeared private, a personal coping mechanism for unbearable loss. But soon it permeated the functions of governance. The queen's corpse was positioned during council meetings, an unyielding witness to state decisions. Her chair remained at the head of the table, her jeweled hands resting as though in eternal repose. Ministers hesitated to contradict the king, unsure whether her silent gaze implied judgment or favor. The court began to adopt rituals, speaking politely to a lifeless figure, bowing in deference to a queen who could no longer acknowledge their loyalty. The line between life and death, respect and fear, had blurred into a daily performance of dread. The king's nightly vigils grew longer. He would sit for hours, sometimes until dawn, dressing her in fresh gowns, brushing her hair, and even whispering arguments or ideas for her response. Servants who dared intervene reported his fury, and many resigned rather than witness the macabre routines. Artists in attendance were instructed to maintain her appearance meticulously, even as decay threatened the fragile preservation. Candles were lit continuously to illuminate her presence, creating shadows that danced across the walls, and amplified the sense of haunted devotion. Visitors to the palace found themselves caught in a nightmare. Foreign ambassadors were led to the queen's chambers, where the monarch insisted on her inclusion in discussions. Some tried to ignore the corpse, others recoiled at the sight of her immobile beauty. Courtiers learned to avert their gaze, speaking to the king alone and nodding at the silent figure as if she were a living participant. Rumors of madness began to spread beyond the palace walls, painting the kingdom as a place of horror and obsession. Yet the king's authority remained unchallenged. His grief had become intertwined with power, and defiance carried peril. The obsession began to affect the king's health and judgment. His sleep was broken, his meals irregular, and his decisions increasingly erratic. Laws and decrees reflected his fixation rather than reason. Resources were diverted to maintain the queen's room, purchase embalming materials, and fund artistic tributes to her eternal beauty. Diplomats grew wary. Neighboring kingdoms hesitated to engage in trade or alliances, and unrest simmered among the populace. The king's obsession, though personal, had become a public crisis, a reflection of how grief unchecked by counsel or restraint can distort not just a life, but an entire realm. Within the palace, stories of fear and superstition began to circulate. Servants spoke of strange phenomena, footsteps echoing where no one walked, the faint scent of perfume lingering after the chamber was empty, and the monarch's shadow moving toward the queen's coffin in the dead of night. Some whispered that the king had begun to see her respond, that his mind, fractured by sorrow, projected life onto the lifeless form. Whether illusion or madness, the stories added to the palace's growing reputation as a place of the uncanny, a kingdom haunted not by ghosts alone, but by the obsession of a sovereign unwilling to release the dead. The king, however, remained blind to these warnings. To him, the queen was not gone. She existed in a state between life and death, an eternal partner who demanded care, attention, and respect. He consulted her on matters of diplomacy, strategy, and even domestic policy, framing each decision as a conversation. Advisors, aware of the delicate balance between influence and confrontation, learned to address the queen respectfully, bowing to the coffin, nodding in acknowledgement, and offering their counsel as if she could respond. The palace had become a theater of grief, devotion, and terror, where life and death coexisted in unsettling harmony. As months turned into years, the court itself transformed. Celebrations were muted or abandoned. Festivals were subdued, for joy seemed sacrilegious in the presence of the eternal queen. Diplomats found themselves performing rituals, merchants adjusted to delays, and citizens learned to speak carefully of the monarch. Fear and respect intertwined, and the king's obsessions set a tone that affected every corner of his realm. The once vibrant palace had become a mausoleum of devotion, a kingdom governed by grief and haunted by memory. Yet the monarch's obsession was not entirely without precedent in the eyes of history. Tales of rulers who mourned deeply, who honored their lost consorts, could be found in scrolls and legends. But what distinguished this king was the refusal to acknowledge death at all. Grief had become a living thing within the palace, a force that shaped law, governance, and human behavior. The queen's corpse, preserved in perfection, became a symbol both of love's endurance and of its dangerous extremes. Even the king's own identity shifted. He began to measure his days not in hours or events, but in the rituals surrounding his queen. Each dawn began with her observation. Each night ended with her presence. Friends, allies, and advisors grew accustomed to addressing a corpse as though it were a living being, and they feared the consequences of failing to comply. The kingdom had become an extension of the king's mourning, a reflection of obsession that blurred the boundary between devotion and tyranny. Some courtiers attempted intervention. Priests offered counsel, suggesting that divine will required the release of the queen's soul. Ministers reminded the king of state matters that demanded attention. Even family members attempted gentle persuasion. But the monarch's grief had hardened into unyielding obsession. He defended his rituals as expressions of love, devotion, and fidelity. To release her, he argued, would be to betray the bond they had shared, and in his mind, Such betrayal was unthinkable. Thus, the palace entered a long period of eerie stillness, where life and death coexisted under the same roof and the consequences of obsession rippled outward. The monarch, once admired for wisdom and authority, now became a figure of dread and fascination. Visitors, historians, and subjects spoke in hushed tones of the king who ruled beside a corpse, and the palace became both a shrine and a cautionary tale. The stage was set for the final chapter, a reckoning of obsession, morality, and the human mind's capacity for grief and darkness. As years passed, the king's obsession reached its zenith. The line between life and death in the palace had completely eroded, leaving a kingdom governed not by reason, law, or counsel, but by grief and fixation. Courtiers walked on eggshells, advisors hesitated at every word, and servants obeyed rituals that made no logical sense but were demanded by the monarch's relentless devotion. Visitors whispered of dark shadows, the faint perfume of the queen lingering where no one had been, and the eerie feeling of a kingdom trapped in time. The court had become a stage for a tragic theater of obsession, where the king was both actor and prisoner. The monarch himself began to deteriorate. Endless nights spent beside his queen's corpse, speaking, rehearsing, and attending to her, drained his health and clouded his judgment. The palace, once a symbol of power and prosperity, now carried a palpable air of decay. Wealth continued to pour into the preservation of the queen, but the resources for the kingdom's welfare dwindled. Agricultural projects stalled, trade agreements faltered, and the people murmured in growing unease. The king's obsession, private at first, had metastasized into a public crisis, threatening both the stability of his rule and the well-being of his subjects. Yet, even as his mind weakened, he refused to release her. Every physician, priest, and advisor who suggested it was met with outrage or banishment. The monarch framed his actions as sacred devotion, a testament to love that could not be broken by death. To him, to part with her body would have been a betrayal of the bond they had shared, a love so profound that life and death were meaningless distinctions. Within the palace, the lines of reality blurred further. Courtiers began to avoid direct conversation with the king, communicating instead through gestures and murmurs, careful not to disturb the fragile equilibrium of obsession and fear. Inevitably, rumors of madness and grotesque devotion reached neighboring kingdoms. Envoys returned with stories that painted the monarch as unhinged, ruling beside a corpse, preserving the illusion of life in defiance of nature itself. Diplomats became wary, trade diminished, and alliances weakened. The once feared and respected king had become a cautionary tale, a ruler whose personal obsession threatened the very foundation of his power. The court's fear was palpable. Servants whispered about strange nightly rituals, sightings of the king speaking to shadows, and the queen's corpse being repositioned to watch over events that unfolded within the palace walls. But the consequences extended beyond politics. The king's personal health and sanity declined sharply. Endless vigils, irregular meals, and obsessive attention to the corpse left him frail and erratic. Advisors grew desperate, yet none dared oppose him openly. The court had become a mirror of the monarch's mind, fractured, fearful, and unable to challenge the prevailing obsession. Stories of servants fainting at the sight of the queen, of children refusing to enter the palace, and of ministers succumbing to anxiety or madness became common. The king's grief, transformed into obsession, had infected every corner of the court. Over time, the king became a shadow of his former self. His decisions, once calculated and decisive, became erratic. He would declare new decrees simply to honor his queen's presence, shift the positions of her body during ceremonies, and demand that her council be consulted on matters ranging from taxation to war. The kingdom, once prosperous and orderly, now suffered under the weight of irrational rule. Yet no one dared act decisively against him, for fear of both his authority and the supernatural reputation that now surrounded the palace. Eventually, the monarch's obsession precipitated his own downfall. Isolated from reason, Surrounded by a court that feared speaking truth and ruled by grief rather than prudence, he became vulnerable. Health failing and mind consumed by his devotion, he passed away beside his queen's body, never relinquishing the hold of obsession. His death, though natural, was seen by many as the inevitable conclusion of a life governed by grief, unchecked by counsel, morality, or practicality. The kingdom he left behind was both haunted and transformed. The queen's corpse, now unaccompanied, remained in the palace for a time as a symbol of devotion and warning. Courtiers recorded the events, chronicling a reign where love and madness intertwined, leaving behind a tale that would echo through history. The monarchy itself recovered gradually, but the legend of the king who could not release his queen persisted, a cautionary reminder of the dangers of obsession and unchecked grief. Historians would later debate the monarch's intentions. Some argued he acted out of pure love, unable to confront the finality of death. Others insisted his actions revealed a mind twisted by power and isolation, where devotion became tyranny and love mutated into horror. What remained indisputable, however, was the indelible mark his obsession left on the kingdom, the palace, and the memory of his reign. The legacy of the monarch who lived with a dead wife's body was immortalized in chronicles, poems, and tales told for generations. Children learned of the tale as a warning. Poets immortalized the image of eternal devotion turned macabre, and historians pondered the limits of human grief and obsession. Scholars argued endlessly about the boundary between love and madness, devotion and horror, mortality and denial. The palace, once a vibrant seat of power, had become a mausoleum of devotion, a monument to the consequences of obsession. And yet, amid the horror, the story carried a strange fascination. Travelers, artists, and storytellers journeyed to the palace to witness the remnants of the tale, to glimpse the lingering echoes of grief, and to ponder the human capacity for attachment that defies even death itself. The king's love had been absolute, unyielding, and ultimately destructive, a tragic fusion of devotion and obsession that left a permanent imprint on history. The story concludes not merely as a chronicle of horror, but as a meditation on the extremes of human emotion. It is a tale of love so profound that reason falters, of power so absolute that fear amplifies obsession, and of grief so consuming that it eclipses morality, practicality, and life itself. The king's devotion became legend, a haunting reminder that even the noblest of intentions can lead to ruin when unchecked by wisdom, perspective, or compassion. In the end, the tale of the monarch who lived with his dead wife's body is a story that transcends time. It is a story of love and loss, obsession and madness, devotion and decay. It is a reminder of the fragile boundary between admiration and horror, between human attachment and destructive fixation. It lingers in memory, in history, and in the imagination, echoing a cautionary lesson across generations. That grief, when consumed by obsession, can destroy not only the grieving, but all who dwell within their shadow. If this story of obsession, love, and madness captivated you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to explore more chilling tales of history's darkest monarchs. Share your thoughts in the comments.